Greetings. I'm Susan Olenwine, and I'm on the piano faculty at the Center for Musical Arts, which is a partner music school with the Colorado Music Festival. I was asked to do a pre-concert discussion on Rachmaninoff. Clearly, that is a broad topic, so I have decided to narrow it down to something more specific, something that has actually intrigued me for a long time about Rachmaninoff's music. Here are two musical fragments that are central to my discussion. And the second. Either or both of these fragments might be familiar to you, and I promise you by the end of this discussion, you will know why. So I have for a long time been curious about the occurrence of this one, which is the Dies Irae, which we hear often in Rachmaninoff's music and in the works of other composers. So I decided to use this opportunity to research why he uses this musical fragment and share what I have learned with you. Even though several of Rachmaninoff's works will be performed at the music festival this summer, I'm going to focus on just one, the Rhapsody on a Theme of Paganini. But let's start a little bit with some history. The original Dies Irae chant is credited to Tommaso Celano, who lived approximately from 1190 to 1260. That's 70 years, which is really quite a lengthy age back in that period of time. There are 19 sections of the original chant, which is also known as the Day of Wrath. The text at the beginning is, "O day of wrath, that day when earth will be reduced to ashes." And the 19 verses later, it ends with, "How tearful that day will be when from the ashes arise the guilty man for judgment. Therefore, spare him, O God." The text of the full Dies Irae conjures up images of blasting trumpets, hellfire, and dead bodies rising from their graves. It carries an ominous sense of dread, a chilling reminder of the inevitability of death, and serves as a warning of living a sinful life. Here's the whole chant again, beginning of it. If we use only the first four notes, we call this a motif. And a motif is a short musical expression that is easily identifiable, and composers use it throughout their musical works for specific reasons and in a variety of ways. So you're already probably identifying with this motif, and even if we just use three notes of it, chances are you're going to hear it in a composition. It can be varied, it can be lengthened, bass instruments. It can be faster. Or so there are so many possibilities for a composer to change and vary this motif. By the end of the 16th century, this particular version of the Dies Irae was common in liturgical use, specifically for the Requiem Mass for the dead. There were other musical settings of the text, but this one seemed to have special appeal to composers who used it in their own masses. Now, let's jump ahead a few hundred years with the full knowledge that Celano's chant had been used countless times in liturgical music. During the 18th century, as the size and scope of orchestras and choruses grew, as well as the complexity of compositions, the fragment of this original Dies Irae subject continued to find its way into larger masses. Composers began to see how it could be used as an expressive subject, and its use was used both in the chorus and in orchestras. Later, it made its way into secular compositions, and vivid expressive use of instruments were becoming more common as orchestras grew both in size and with new instruments added to the orchestras. In the 19th century, the chant was taking on new dimension by Romantic composers, specifically Berlioz, Liszt, and Mussorgsky, because by now it was so easily recognizable to audiences, they were able to capitalize on its immediate effect on audiences. So now the ones that we hear mostly are Berlioz' Symphonie Fantastique, Liszt's Totentanz, and Mussorgsky's Night on Bald Mountain. It was with Berlioz and Liszt that we really hear the chant used for the first time as the main character in a composition. So let's turn to Berlioz' Symphonie Fantastique. When he was writing this, he was very frustrated. He wrote to his sister and he described the effect of the text of the original Day of Wrath on him as he was composing the Symphonie Fantastique. And I quote, "The poem of the Dies Irae so intoxicated and excited me that nothing lucid came to me. My head boiled, I felt dizzy. Today, the eruption is under control, and God willing, all will go well." And he ended up using it in the fifth movement of the Symphonie Fantastique. It is the demonic witches' Sabbath dance. The brass is intoning the chant, and there's a diabolical orgy going on overhead in the strings. The motif is altered rhythmically, and it visualizes grotesque witches and monsters at play. Now I'm going to try to play a recording of this and hope that from my phone it will reach your ears. This is the opening to the fifth movement. And he uses all 8 notes. So that's followed by the middle brass playing it twice as fast, and then the tempo is doubled yet again and altered and played in the high strings. And here is the sample of that. I really do hope you were able to hear that. So why is this relevant to Rachmaninoff? Bear with me, we are going to get there. So now we're going to look at Liszt's Totentanz, a work for piano and orchestra. It is a massive set of variations for piano and orchestra and based entirely on the full subject of the Dies Irae. This serves directly as the model for Rachmaninoff's own Rhapsody on a Theme of Paganini. But before Liszt wrote the Totentanz, he had composed a complete piano transcription of Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique. So we know that he was familiar intimately with that work. At the same time, he was becoming entranced with the technical facility of violinist Niccolò Paganini at that time. He was described not only as virtuosic, but demonic. We are also familiar with the virtuosity of Liszt himself, and he composed piano variations based on a theme of Paganini. These are a huge challenge to any pianist. So, in addition to the discussion about the dark images of the Dies Irae chant, there is a demonic story linked to Paganini. The legend is he had gained his dizzying talent after sealing a pact with the devil. So here, Liszt is exploring the dark side of the chant in conjunction with the fiendish legend of Paganini. Now, finally on to Rachmaninoff. What does the Dies Irae mean to Rachmaninoff? Throughout his career as a pianist and conductor, he had intimacy with these works. They were personal favorites. and he conducted and played them frequently during his international tours. One can only imagine how these frequent performances allowed him to absorb the multiple transformations of this musical motif as he was performing them. Also, many historians acknowledge Rachmaninoff's preoccupation with the mysteries of death and his close association with the religion and music of the Russian Orthodoxy. Then, as a student at the Moscow Conservatory and early in his conducting career, he would have encountered the Dies Irae quoted in a number of 19th century works, usually connected to death and the supernatural, as well as liturgical works between the 13th and 19th centuries. Rachmaninoff fits the popular image of Russian gloom. Stravinsky described him as, quote, a 6.5-foot tall scowl, unquote, and mentioned that he was much preoccupied with death. Pianist Nikolai Lugansky, who will perform with CMF in July, says this, and I quote, for Rachmaninoff, the idea of death was about what happens after death. Everybody thinks about this. The existence of religion is sometimes connected with this fear of death and thoughts of death. Rachmaninoff was very simple orthodox. He never talked about these things publicly. He was not an open person. For him, it was vulgar to speak about such deep things, but in his music, it appears much deeper and much wider, end of quote. Many of Rachmaninoff's works fit the mold of this characteristic Russian brooding. All three of his numbered symphonies, the 4 piano concertos, the piano sonatas, the Paganini Rhapsody, and the symphonic dances are all written in the minor key. Even more significance, however, is the observation that about 1/3 of all of his compositions use this Dies Irae motif, making it an identical musical element that spanned his compositional career of 50 years. But despite having used it for 5 decades, he seemed not to have researched it until much later in his life. It wasn't until 1931 that he approached a musicologist to request the full music of the entire 19 verses of the original chant. Now, for the remainder of this presentation, we'll focus on the Rhapsody on a Theme of Paganini because it so clearly illustrates his use of the Dies Irae subject. The Rhapsody on a Theme of Paganini was composed for piano and orchestra and is sometimes referred to as his 5th piano concerto. It was composed in 1934 with the main theme borrowed from the A minor study of Niccolò Paganini. Remember that? So recall also that this is a theme that Liszt also used in 2 of his compositions for piano. So while Liszt used the Dies Irae subject as his theme for the Totentanz, Rachmaninoff uses the same chant motif as a counter melody to the Paganini theme. There is also a programmatic plan, which is documented by the composer. The origin of the Rhapsody was originally from a request from a choreographer to write a program for a ballet called Paganini Fantastic Ballet. Rachmaninoff's program helps us understand the use of the Dies Irae. First is the legend of Paganini selling his soul to the devil in exchange for perfection of art and a woman. The variations of the Dies Irae, explains the composer, all represent the devil. The chant theme first appears in variation 7 as a duet with the Paganini theme. Before that, it's only the Paganini theme. Here, the chant is long sustained notes in the piano, while the Paganini theme is played by the cellos and the bass. So the piano part here is the same time, the cellos and the bass are playing variation. And even though it's not exact, you hear the Paganini theme. And together, it sounds like this. So the variations from number 11 to 18 then represent love episodes with a woman. The 18th variation is the most recognizable, as it has been extracted from this large work and reinvented in numerous instrumental settings for popular listening. And it is this one that we all know. This beautiful variation just seems to come out of nowhere, but there is a definite connection to the original Paganini motif. So if we played it and turn it upside down, and let's make it major. And there we have the Paganini motif opening this beautiful variation. So the use of the Dies Irae motif becomes more and more prominent after variation 19, and it's expressed in a variety of ways between the orchestra and the piano in conjunction with the Paganini theme. So while you may have previously heard this work and hear the Paganini theme, I am hoping that the next time you hear it, your experience will be enriched because you will become more and more aware of the Dies Irae theme. And as you listen to the performance, I also encourage you to try to visualize the characters invoked originally for the ballet and do your own mental choreography. And if you have the opportunity, listen to some recordings of this rhapsody before you attend the performance. So what is the conclusion? Was Rachmaninoff so preoccupied with death that the Day of Wrath motif became a substantial part of his compositions? Or did he have other reasons to populate his compositions so frequently with this musical idea? In my research, I was fortunate to have found a dissertation by Susan Woodard on the extensive use of the composer of this chant theme in his piano works. She observes that, and I'm going to paraphrase, a logical conclusion to be drawn is that the influence of the models of earlier composers would seem to have been very strong. The Dies Irae could have been used thematically, motivically, and figuratively. It lends itself to variation, transformation, expansion, contraction. It's very versatile. And it allowed him to use the motif in conjunction with his long lyrical themes, of which he is so fond. We really don't know, but now that I have introduced you to this information, you can draw your own conclusions. The Dies Irae appears in all of the works that will be performed in this summer's music festival of Rachmaninoff. I persuade you to try to hear the quotes of the motif, consider what instruments are playing it and what is the context. Listen to how he treats it in the Rhapsody. And then how does identifying this subject affect how you are hearing the music in all of the works programmed for this summer's festival? And how does this information enrich your appreciation for Rachmaninoff's use of the Dies Irae chant? So that's the end of my discussion. Thank you for listening. And I really hope that you will enjoy this summer's music festival.